Putin loses hope after Zelensky reverses course and provokes a brutal crisis in Russia, to the point that even Putin, back in 1999, turns out to have been right about a prediction he himself made.
Do you know what I'm going to tell you? That this constant blaming outside forces for all our problems is wrong. Wrong at its core. All our problems lie within us. Everything comes from our own irresponsibility and weakness.
All our problems are of our own making. Look at our economy. It's pure misery. Look at our international relations. There are chasms everywhere. At that time, it sounded like a diagnosis. Today, it seems like the result of 27 years in power. The phrase started circulating again when the Russian budget showed a bigger deficit. Companies have seen the worst business environment since 2022, and Ukrainian attacks have increased the pressure on oil revenues. Zelensky also partially backtracked after firing Mikhail Fedorov. He kept the former minister on his team and blocked the replacement that caused protests and outrage among the military. At the same time, Ukraine struck vessels from the Russian Shadow Fleet and deployed armed robots and drones to operate together on the front lines. And it made progress on a gas agreement with the United States to further cut dependence on Moscow. Putin promised to rebuild a strong Russia. Now he faces a slowing economy, rising war expenses, while Moscow responds to criticism with silence and resignation. Zelensky removed Mikhail Fedorov from the Ministry of Defense after only 6 months in office and triggered a crisis that could benefit Moscow. Fedorov was one of the main figures linked to the modernization of drones, military digitalization, and changes in defense procurement. The decision sparked protests in Kyiv and other cities, met resistance in parliament, and affected an area that had been inflicting losses on Russia. More than 1,000 people gathered in front of the presidential office, while Ihor Klimenko's name did not command enough support to take over the defense ministry. Zelensky changed his tone. The president said he wanted unity, acknowledged his responsibility for the crisis, and stated that Fedorov would remain part of the team, although his role had not yet been defined. Fedorov turned down the offer to serve as an advisor at that point, but his departure was no longer unfolding along the simple path the government had planned. The replacement stalled, and the pressure increased. Zelensky did not return the ministry to Fedorov. However, he had to rework the decision before the crisis reached the defense sector. That's when he reversed course. He moved forward, encountered resistance, and partially retreated.
The president should not be singled out in any way in a critical situation like this during the war. I say this with complete sincerity. I truly want unity. The parties did not find it. And this problem is not just the parties or mine. In other words, I'm not shirking my responsibility. As I told you, I respect the parties, I know their strengths and weaknesses, and I would really like them to strengthen Ukraine. But it is what it is. And in a situation like this, you have a choice, one side or the other, because without me, they won't sit together.
The deputy commander of the Air Force, Pavlo Yelizarov, also resigned and stated that Fedorov's removal harmed Ukraine's defense capability. Zelensky realized that he was not facing just a parliamentary dispute. Technicians and commanders feared losing the pace of innovation used to make up for the gap in troop numbers. Putin watched a division that seemed ready to weaken Kyiv. But the pressure prompted a course correction, not silence. This contrast also appeared in a street interview video published by Nexta, in which Russians were asked about criticism of the government during the war. Some responded that it was better to endure, accept, and trust those in charge. A young woman said she had her own opinion, but preferred to go along with the majority. It reveals an environment where disagreement is risky.
I sincerely hope that everything that was agreed with us in Anchorage will be respected, and that after that he will want to call Putin to discuss everything again, so that Putin would have the final say. And for us, the final say concerns the validity of all these Istanbul agreements. I really hope that's the case.
It's precisely the country that's at war. You need to understand and know that this is a war. You need to be patient, understand, and try to trust the authorities.
Can you criticize the government during war?
I don't even know how to answer that question. Well, I don't think so.
Why?
I think that criticizing the government in principle is kind of wrong, probably.
You don't need to shout, just express it.
Well, maybe you have your own opinion. I think it's better to listen to the majority.
You can just ask questions where necessary.
Maybe it's better to keep your opinion to yourself.
This silence prevents the Kremlin from correcting the mistakes that Putin claimed to denounce in 1999. The economy started posting figures that make that statement hit even harder. The government began to admit that the 2026 budget deficit is expected to exceed the forecast by more than 1 trillion rubles. In the first half of the year, the deficit reached 5.73 trillion rubles, about 1.7 times higher than the result for the same period last year. The growth forecast dropped to just 0.4%. The Russian central bank took another hit. The business climate indicator fell to 3.6 in July, the lowest level since 2022. The Kremlin stated that the difficulties were not critical, but the response came on the same day that the numbers showed a loss of momentum, rising inflation, and the risk of stagnation. Putin controls the official message. What he doesn't control is the cost of the war within an economy that is increasingly dependent on the state. Ukraine increased this pressure by hitting the ships Louis Duais and Banda in the Black Sea. The Security Service of Ukraine stated that the operation was carried out with the Navy and used maritime drones. The vessels were identified as part of the shadow fleet used to transport Russian oil and circumvent sanctions. Louise reportedly transported about 3 million tons of Urals oil in 2026 and repeatedly turned off its identification system. Russian aircraft tried to prevent the approach, but the drones reached their targets. Each ship hit increases the cost of the operation and threatens a central source of money for Moscow. On the Hulyapol front, the 33rd Assault Regiment introduced another change. Ground robots equipped with Browning M2 machine guns were used along with attack drones against a Russian unit. The idea was to put machines in high-risk areas and preserve soldiers. Russia relied on quantity, artillery, and attrition. Ukraine responded with smaller connected systems capable of surveillance, attack, and transporting materials. The pressure also reached the energy sector. Argent, LNG, and the Ukrainian state company Naftogaz signed a memorandum on July 15, 2026 to study the long-term supply of liquefied natural gas from the United States. The project involves the planned terminal at Port Fourchon in Louisiana with a projected capacity of 25 million tons per year. The gas could arrive at European terminals and then flow through the Ukrainian network to supply Ukraine and other nations in the region. The agreement is still in the planning stage, but it creates a lasting connection and reduces Moscow's leverage over the supply. Putin has used oil and gas as tools of influence for years. Now that Kyiv is trying to link its energy security to the United States and European markets, just as attacks on refineries and Russian ships are creating difficulties inside Russia, it's not just trade. Long-term contracts take customers away from Russian suppliers, reduce the Kremlin's revenue, and make it harder to use winter as political leverage. Zelensky also welcomed Keir Starmer in Kyiv and took part in a tribute to Ukrainian fighters who died defending the nation. The British Prime Minister reaffirmed continued support and announced new resources related to Gripen fighter jets. The visit showed that the political turmoil did not break ties with London. While Putin tries to sell the idea that Ukraine will be abandoned, Kyiv still has allies in the capital, builds defense agreements, and expands its energy ties with the United States. That's where the Putin of 1990 appears as the harshest witness against the Putin of 2026. He used to say that Russian problems were produced within Russia itself. Today, the deficit grows with the war chosen by the Kremlin. International relations were destroyed by the invasion. Oil needs to circulate through a shadow fleet, and the population is pushed to accept power without question. Drones keep advancing over Russian oil. Robots enter the battlefield. New contracts reduce energy dependence, and the Kremlin's budget loses room to hide the bill. The phrase from 1999 hasn't gotten old. It just gained the name of the person responsible. Thank you very much for watching this video until the end. Support our project and contribute financially through the Pix key that appears on your screen. We are an independent channel focused on keeping you informed with the facts. Your contribution helps us keep going.